that Ms. Clancy told her that she heard a male voice instructing her to first kill her children and then to kill herself.
So the same.
If she didn't do it now, she would lose her chance. That's what Lindsay Clancy says a man's voice told her. Not a person standing in the room. Not her husband, not a neighbor, not a stranger at the door. A voice. Inside her own head, ordering her to kill her 3 children and then herself. She says she heard it on the evening of January 24th, 2023. But here's the part that is splitting a Massachusetts courtroom wide open right now in the summer of 2026. The very first time Lindsay Clancy ever told a living soul about that voice was a full week after her 3 children were already dead. No warning beforehand. No frantic call about voices in her head. No text to her husband saying something was wrong. Nothing. Until she was lying in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the waist down, with a psychologist hired by her own defense team sitting beside her, the door closed. So did Lindsay Clancy really hear a voice that night? A voice so powerful, so commanding, that it made a devoted mother strangle her own children with exercise bands? Or did she find that voice after the fact, once a legal strategy was already starting to form around her? Welcome to the Homicide Room. If you enjoy true crime, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This isn't a closed case with a tidy answer. It's an active trial happening right now, and the question of that voice has become one of the most fiercely contested details in the entire proceeding. To understand how a courtroom ends up arguing about a voice nobody but the defendant ever heard, you have to go back. Back before the trial, before the arrest, before any of this had a name. Lindsay Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse. Think about what that means for a moment. Her entire career, her daily purpose, was bringing new life safely into the world. She held other people's babies in her hands for a living. Friends who knew her professionally described someone calm under pressure, someone mothers trusted in the most vulnerable moments of their lives. At home, she was building the family she'd always wanted. She married Patrick Clancy, and together they had 3 children in fairly quick succession. Cora, born first, a bright 5-year-old by the time of the killings. Dawson, 3 years old, still small enough to need help with almost everything. And Callan, the baby, just 8 months old, barely old enough to sit up on his own. People who knew Lindsay in those years describe her almost uniformly the same way: devoted. Her own mother, Paula Musgrove, later took the stand and told the jury that having children was the best thing that ever happened to her. A former nanny who worked with the family said Lindsay was a wonderful mother who loved her kids and was never concerned for their safety. That nanny said Lindsay would send her video after video of the children, always grateful, always warm. A relationship that continued even after Lindsay no longer needed her help. "I loved Lindsay," the nanny told the court. The Clancy home reflected that devotion in an almost obsessive way. Investigators who later searched the house noted that photographs of the 3 kids covered nearly every wall, in nearly every room. This was not a household that looked, from the outside, like it was heading toward tragedy. But somewhere in the months following Callan's birth, cracks began to show. Lindsay started struggling with sleep. She described feeling numb. She told her mother, more than once, "This isn't me. I've never been like this before." Her mother testified she agreed completely. This was not the daughter she knew. She sought help. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it complicates any simple narrative of the case. Lindsay was not a woman who ignored what was happening to her. She went to a perinatal mental health clinic. She saw multiple therapists. She saw a psychiatric nurse practitioner, Rebecca Gelota, and a psychiatrist, Dr. Jennifer Tufts, who conducted over a dozen telehealth appointments with her across roughly 4 months, the very last one taking place the day before the killings. She was prescribed a long list of medications: depression medication, anxiety medication, medication for sleep. At one point, she raised concerns about becoming dependent on the benzodiazepines she'd been given to help her sleep. Her defense attorney would later argue this list of medications, and the lack of coordinated oversight over what she was taking played a direct role in what happened. Her providers, he argued in cross-examination, relied almost entirely on what Lindsay told them, with little independent verification. No one, for instance, ever ordered a blood test to check whether her hormone levels, which shift dramatically after childbirth, might explain some of what she was experiencing. At an intake appointment in December, a therapist noted Lindsay's ongoing lack of sleep, feelings of numbness, and a persistent fear that something bad would happen to her children. That same clinician testified she saw no signs of psychosis or mania in Lindsay at that time. On the surface, day to day, Lindsay kept functioning in a way that would strike most people as normal, even affectionate. She sent her husband a heart and smile emoji reply when he texted her, "You're a good mama." She wrote detailed personal notes expressing doubt about parenting choices, like whether she'd made the right call stopping breastfeeding Callan or whether they should try for a fourth child at all. But underneath the surface, according to her defense, something else was happening, something far darker and far harder to see from the outside. And on the evening of January 24th, 2023, whatever it was came fully to the surface. Patrick Clancy left the house that evening to run what should have been 2 quick errands: pick up dinner from a restaurant and stop at CVS to grab medication for one of the children. He was gone for roughly 25 minutes. Prosecutors say that the time gap was not an accident. They allege Lindsay used a mapping app beforehand to calculate exactly how long her husband would be out of the house. Evidence, in their view, of deliberate planning rather than a mind in chaos. When Patrick came home, the house was unnervingly quiet. He found Lindsay first, outside in the backyard. She was bleeding, having cut her own wrists and neck. At some point that evening, she had also jumped from a second-story window of the home. He asked her, urgently, where the children were. "In the basement," she told him. What happened next is captured, in full, on an 8-minute 911 call that has since been played for the jury. One of the most anticipated and devastating pieces of evidence in the entire trial. Patrick can be heard running to the basement, calling out for his kids, and then screaming in agony and shock as he found them. All 3 children still had the exercise bands used to strangle them tied around their necks. He pulled the bands away with his own hands and begged them to breathe. They did not. Jurors, people who had already sat through weeks of difficult testimony by that point, visibly could not hold themselves together listening to that call. Some fought back tears. Others were described as visibly shaken. Lindsay survived her suicide attempt, but just barely. A forensic pathologist later testified that her body temperature had dropped to 82 degrees Fahrenheit by the time first responders reached her. The result of lying on frozen ground in January cold, the pathologist explained, which stripped her body of its ability to regulate its own temperature. The fall and her injuries left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. She has needed a wheelchair ever since, and her transportation to and from court became its own ongoing legal fight, with her defense arguing she required an ambulance for medical reasons and prosecutors countering that a standard transport van would suffice. Lindsay has never denied that she is the one who killed her children. That fact is not contested by either side. What is contested, what this entire trial exists to determine, is whether she should be held criminally responsible for what she did. Under Massachusetts law, that comes down to a defense known as lack of criminal responsibility, more commonly called an insanity defense. If a jury finds that Lindsay was legally insane at the moment she killed her children, that she could not understand the nature of what she was doing, or could not conform her conduct to the law because of severe mental illness, she would not go to prison. Instead, she would likely be committed to a secure mental health facility. Her defense attorney, Kevin Reddington, tried early on to split the trial into 2 separate phases. One where jurors would decide simply whether she committed the acts, and a second, entirely separate phase to determine her mental state and criminal responsibility. The court did not grant that request. Instead, jurors are hearing everything together, weighing the horror of the crime scene and the question of her sanity in the very same breath. Prosecutor Shaynan Buckingham, addressing the jury directly, urged them not to treat this trial as a public debate about women's mental health and how the medical system treats women. Her point, essentially, don't let sympathy for a broader issue cloud judgment about what this one specific woman did and why. But that's a hard thing to ask of 12 people sitting in a room built with the very same emotional gravity Buckingham is warning against. Because whatever the jury ultimately decides, this case has already forced an uncomfortable public reckoning with postpartum psychosis, a real, rare, and severe psychiatric condition that can trigger hallucinations, delusions, and rapid onset breaks with reality in the days or weeks after childbirth. It's estimated to affect only 1 or 2 women out of every 1,000 who give birth. It is not something to be dismissed lightly. But it is also not something a jury can verify happened simply because a defense attorney names it. And that tension, a real, serious condition on one hand and one uncorroborated claim of a voice on the other, is exactly where the trial's sharpest and most disputed moment lives. This is where the case takes its most contested turn, and it centers on 9 words. If she didn't do it now, she would lose her chance. To understand why those words matter so much, you have to understand the timeline around them. Because the timeline is, in many ways, the entire argument. In the days immediately following the killings, while Lindsay was hospitalized and recovering from her own injuries, doctors evaluated her mental state multiple times. And here is a detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves in coverage of this case. In those very first evaluations, Lindsay denied everything that would later become central to her defense. Dr. Sejal Shah, who examined Lindsay multiple times at Brigham and Women's Hospital in the weeks after the killings, testified that in a January 30th, 2023 assessment, less than a week after her children died, Lindsay denied having any suicidal or homicidal intentions. She denied having hallucinations or delusions that day. Her thought process, Shaw testified, was organized and goal-directed. In a separate assessment weeks later, Lindsay was described as focused on her legal situation and looking forward to physical rehabilitation, practical, forward-looking, coherent. On cross-examination, the defense pushed back on what that really proves. Shaw acknowledged, under questioning, that a person can be experiencing psychosis and still communicate clearly, still make plans, still appear outwardly composed. Psychosis, another physician testified later in the trial, just means a lack of understanding of what's real as opposed to what is not. And it can coexist, at least in theory, with moments of apparent clarity. Still, the sequence is what makes this so difficult to untangle. No hallucinations reported immediately after the killings. No voices mentioned to doctors treating her in the hospital in those first days. Nothing. Then, roughly a week after her children's deaths, Lindsay called her husband from her hospital bed. That call did not happen alone, and it did not happen casually. It happened with psychologist Paul Ziesel in the room, a psychologist hired by Lindsay's own defense team. Ziesel had gone to considerable lengths to be there at all. No one had been allowed into Lindsay's hospital room in the earliest days after the killings. Reddington, her attorney, eventually obtained a court order specifically to get Ziesel in to see her. A state trooper, Sergeant Dan Lawler, was posted outside her door as part of hospital security during this period, and he later testified that when Ziesel's visit took place, the door to Lindsay's room was closed. During that visit, Ziesel allowed Lindsay to use his personal cell phone to call Patrick. It didn't go through the first time. Patrick didn't answer, and Lindsay left a voicemail. 2 days later, they tried again, and this time he picked up. According to Ziesel's own testimony, Lindsay told Patrick she loved him very much. She expressed real emotion during the call, and then she told him what she says happened the night their children died, that she'd heard a male voice, ordering her, telling her that she didn't have a choice, that she had to kill her children and then herself. If she didn't do it now, she'd lose her chance. It was, according to Patrick's own testimony, the very first time Lindsay had ever mentioned hearing a voice. not before the killings, not in the immediate hospital evaluations right after. Only then, in that specific call, with that specific psychologist in the room, a week into a case that was already becoming a criminal matter. Given that timeline, it should be no surprise the prosecution went after it hard. Their theory, floated through cross-examination of Sergeant Lawler, was blunt. That Zizel, the psychologist Lindsay's own defense team sent in to see her, may have coached her, directly or indirectly, to say she'd heard voices. That the voice wasn't a psychiatric symptom being reported for the first time. It was a legal strategy, being built in real time, dressed up as a medical disclosure. It's an explosive accusation. If true, it would mean the entire cornerstone of Lindsay's insanity defense was manufactured, not experienced. A fabricated symptom handed to her by the very team responsible for keeping her out of prison. But here's the twist within the twist, and it happened just this month, in front of the jury. When Reddington cross-examined Sergeant Lawler about that exact theory, the idea that Zizel had prompted Lindsay to claim she heard voices, Lawler had to concede something significant under oath. He acknowledged there was no actual investigative evidence supporting it. No proof, Zizel said anything of the kind to Lindsay. It was, in his own words, another investigator's speculation, a theory that had circulated inside the case but had never been substantiated. Legal analysts covering the trial called it a meaningful moment for the defense, not because it proved Lindsay really did hear a voice, but because it took away the prosecution's cleanest explanation for why she might be lying about it. The theory that someone told her to say it collapsed under its own weight. But collapsing that theory doesn't answer the deeper question hanging over the entire trial. It just leaves it exactly where it started. A woman says she heard a voice order her to kill her children. No one else heard it. No one can independently verify it happened. She said nothing about it in her very first days of psychiatric evaluation, when doctors asked her directly. She only said it a week later, in a private, closed-door conversation, arranged specifically by her own legal defense. That is not proof it didn't happen. Psychosis, and the shame and confusion that can come with it, do not always announce themselves cleanly or immediately. Trauma responses are famously nonlinear, and some experts note that patients in acute crisis sometimes cannot articulate what they experienced until the immediate danger has passed and they feel safe enough to speak. But it is also not proof that it did. And a jury now has to make a decision about criminal responsibility using exactly that kind of ambiguity as its foundation. Making the picture even murkier is Lindsay's own internet search history in the days leading up to the killings. Introduced into evidence by a state police cell forensics expert, Sergeant Timothy Chiappini, who spent hours combing through her phone. On January 19th, 2023, 5 days before her children died, Lindsay searched schizophrenia at 8:58 in the morning. Roughly 90 minutes later, she searched hallucinations. The next night, January 20th, at around 8:30 in the evening, she typed into her phone, "Can you treat a sociopath?" 10 minutes after that search, she looked up information about psychosis. In the weeks before that, at the end of December 2022, she'd searched suicide methods, information about bipolar disorder, and insomnia. In January, she searched postpartum depression. Back in October 2022, months earlier, she'd written a long, detailed note expressing doubt about her own parenting decisions, questioning whether she'd made the right call, stopping breastfeeding Callan, wondering whether they should try for a fourth child. Chiappini's testimony also touched on Lindsay's family life in that window. Her mother had texted her on January 19th, the same day as the schizophrenia and hallucinations searches, saying, "I'll bring it Saturday," suggesting an upcoming visit. 3 days later, on January 22nd, her mother texted again, "Nice to see you doing better." From the outside, at least to the people closest to her, things looked as though they might be improving. 2 days after that message, her children were dead. None of this, on its own, proves anything in either direction. People search all kinds of things online without acting on them. But laid end to end, across weeks, this search history becomes its own kind of Rorschach test for the jury. and for anyone following this case. Read one way. It's the digital footprint of a woman watching herself come apart in real time, terrified enough by what she was thinking and feeling that she was actively trying to name it, understand it, get ahead of it. Schizophrenia, hallucinations, psychosis, searching for language to describe an experience she didn't yet have words for. Read another way, and this is the reading the prosecution wants the jury to take seriously. It's something closer to a paper trail. A woman searching, "Can you treat a sociopath about herself?" 10 minutes before searching psychosis isn't necessarily documenting an illness overtaking her. She could be researching the very defense she would need only days later, building, unconsciously or not, a record that would later support a claim of mental illness, right around the same time she was allegedly mapping out exactly how long her husband would be gone from the house. Both interpretations sit inside the same handful of search terms. Neither one can be proven just by looking at the searches themselves. This is, ultimately, the entire trial in miniature. The prosecution wants the jury to see a woman who was in control the whole time. Someone capable of complex planning, capable of timing her husband's absence to the minute, capable of building a legal defense before she'd even been arrested for anything. The defense wants the jury to see a woman in the grip of a rare and devastating psychiatric emergency, one severe enough to make her briefly lose touch with reality entirely, hear things that weren't there, and act in ways completely foreign to the devoted, photograph everything, wonderful mother that everyone around her nanny, her mother, her in-laws, insists she truly was. Both sides are looking at the exact same 9 words. If she didn't do it now, she would lose her chance. Neither one can prove, with certainty, what was actually happening inside Lindsay Clancy's mind in the moment she says she heard them. That is the shocking turn this trial has taken. Not a new piece of forensic evidence, not a surprise witness with a smoking gun. Something much harder to resolve than that. A single, unwitnessed, uncorroborated sentence. And an entire jury now tasked with deciding whether to believe it enough to change how 3 children's deaths get classified under the law. Beyond the voice itself, this trial has been marked by moments that are almost unbearable to sit through, even secondhand. During testimony from the state medical examiner's office about the children's autopsies, proceedings were halted multiple times because Lindsay could not stop sobbing. Photographs from the autopsies of Cora and Dawson were shown to the jury. At one point, as Dr. Barbara Olson, the medical examiner who examined Cora, described the child's external injuries, Lindsay was heard crying out, "I can't do this," and court had to be adjourned early. Judge William Sullivan, forced to send the jury out of the room more than once during these outbursts, later reminded jurors directly, "I'm instructing you that the law says you must separate any emotional reaction on your part from the informational value and weight that the evidence produces." A near impossible instruction, given what they were being asked to look at. Jurors were also taken to visit the family's former home in Duxbury directly, walking through the same rooms, including the basement where the children were found, and viewing crime scene video from inside the bedroom where Lindsay cut herself before jumping. State Police Trooper Joshua McKelligan walked jurors through what investigators found room by room. For a case built so heavily on the question of what happened inside one person's mind, there's something almost eerie about a jury physically standing in the space where it happened, trying to reconstruct an internal, invisible experience from a very visible, very ordinary suburban house. Diary entries were read aloud in court as well, offering a different kind of window into Lindsay's state of mind in the months leading up to the killings. In one entry, she wrote about feeling desperate for a break from the constant demands of caring for 3 young children. "It's like I'm so desperate to get a mental break from taking care of everyone that my mind is trying to make something physically wrong with me." She wrote about feeling guilty. She wrote about struggling to sleep train Callan. In another note, closer to the killings, she reflected on a new medication she was considering. "I want to feel happy, but it would be nice to feel authentically happy and not fake. But I need to feel happier than I did last evening, because then I was pretty depressed and not enjoying any of my children." These are not the words most people would associate with someone about to commit an unthinkable act of violence. They read, instead, like the private thoughts of an exhausted, overwhelmed new mother reaching for language to describe a depression she couldn't shake. And that is precisely the defense's point in introducing them. This was not a woman plotting in secret. This was a woman quietly drowning in writing for months while everyone around her, including trained medical professionals, largely failed to see how serious it had become. Patrick Clancy's own testimony, delivered near the start of the prosecution's case, carried enormous weight in the courtroom. He described the aftermath in devastating detail, and he was the one who first told jurors, under oath, about that hospital phone call, the very first time his wife had ever mentioned a voice to him. He has, notably, not turned entirely against Lindsay in the years since the killings. In a 2024 interview with The New Yorker, he said plainly, "I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick." He started a GoFundMe for her within days of the deaths, writing that the real Lindsay was generously loving and caring, and that his only wish was for her to eventually find peace. He has since moved to Manhattan, rebuilding a life apart from the home where his children died. But his public statements have consistently resisted the simplest, most damning version of this story. Lindsay's former mother-in-law, Susan Clancy, also took the stand and, like nearly every character witness called in this trial so far, described Lindsay as a devoted mother who loved her children deeply. She told the court Lindsay had been begging for help in the period before the killings. On cross-examination, jurors heard messages exchanged between Lindsay and her mother-in-law in which Lindsay expressed her own concerns about the medication she was taking, seemingly aware, even before the killings, that something about her treatment wasn't right. By mid-August, after 14 days of testimony, the prosecution rested its case. Their final witness was a digital forensics expert who had spent his career at Celebrite. The same expert, notably, who had testified in both of the widely followed Karen Reed trials, giving this case an odd point of connective tissue to another headline-dominating Massachusetts prosecution. His testimony focused on data pulled from Lindsay's phone and Apple Watch, her heart rate and physical activity on the night of the killings, showing she was walking and climbing stairs, her internet searches for psychiatric medications, depression treatment, and suicidal ideation in the surrounding days and weeks. With the prosecution's case complete, the defense began calling its own witnesses. First up, Lindsay's mother and sister, both of whom painted a picture of a woman who had been quietly struggling long before anyone around her fully grasped how urgent that need had become. Her mother described watching her daughter change in ways she didn't recognize. She would say to me, "This isn't me. I've never been like this before," and said she agreed completely. She also testified that Lindsay believed at least one of her medications was destroying her mind. The trial itself has become something of a cultural phenomenon in its own right, live-streamed in full and drawing an intense, sustained online audience. Journalists and spectators have packed the physical courtroom day after day, while online, self-described sleuths and commentators, many of them on TikTok, dissect every piece of testimony almost in real time, debating psychosis versus premeditation with the same fervor once reserved for other high-profile Massachusetts trials in recent years. It's worth pausing here, away from the courtroom drama for a moment, to sit with what postpartum psychosis actually is, because so much of this trial hinges on whether jurors believe it applies to Lindsay Clancy at all. Postpartum psychosis is recognized by psychiatrists as a genuine medical emergency, not a vague or catch-all label. It typically emerges rapidly, sometimes within days of childbirth, sometimes weeks or even months later, as appears to be alleged here. It can cause a cluster of severe symptoms: hallucinations, in which a person hears or sees things that are not there; delusions, in which a person holds fixed, false beliefs disconnected from reality; extreme mood swings that can swing from mania to deep depression within hours; and, in its most dangerous form, thoughts of harming oneself or one's children. Medical experts who study the condition stress that it is rare. Again, roughly 1 to 2 cases per 1,000 births, but also that when it does occur, it can escalate with frightening speed, sometimes leaving very little warning window between the first signs and a full break with reality. That rarity cuts both ways in a courtroom. It makes the condition genuinely hard for jurors and for the general public to understand intuitively. Most people have never encountered it, never seen what it looks like up close, and have no personal frame of reference for how someone in its grip might behave, speak, or later describe what happened to them. That's part of what makes this trial so uncomfortable to watch and so compelling to cover. It's forcing an audience of ordinary people, on the jury, and now watching from home, to hold two things in their minds at once: a horror almost too large to process, 3 young children strangled by their own mother, and a genuine medical possibility that the woman responsible may not have been in any meaningful sense herself when it happened. The defense's expert witnesses, expected to testify in the coming days of the trial, will almost certainly try to walk that line directly, explaining not just what postpartum psychosis is in the abstract, but building a case for why Lindsay's specific documented symptoms, medication history, sleep deprivation, and the timeline of that hospital phone call fit a recognizable clinical pattern rather than a convenient legal story. The prosecution's cross-examinations of those same experts will almost certainly focus on the gaps: the lack of any hallucination reports before the killings, the composed, goal-directed evaluations in her first days of hospitalization, and the fact that the voice only entered the record once a defense team, a court order, and a closed hospital room door were all already in place. As it stands today, there is no verdict. The defense's case is still unfolding, expected to lean heavily on that expert psychiatric testimony aimed at convincing the jury that what Lindsay experienced on January 24th, 2023, was a genuine, medically recognizable break with reality. Not a performance, not a strategy, but postpartum psychosis in its most severe and tragic form. The prosecution, for its part, has already made clear where it wants the jury's attention to stay. Not on sympathy for a broader public health crisis around maternal mental illness, but on the specific, deliberate-seeming choices made on one specific night. The timed errand, the search history, the searches about sociopathy sitting right alongside searches about psychosis, and a claim about a voice that surfaced only once a legal defense was already being built around her. 12 jurors now carry the weight of deciding something that medicine itself struggles to prove with certainty. What was actually happening inside one woman's mind in the moment she says a voice told her she had no choice? Was it real? Was it remembered wrong, reshaped by trauma and time? Was it something closer to a story, arriving at exactly the moment a story was needed? We may not know until this trial reaches its end. And when it does, when this jury finally delivers whatever verdict they reach, we'll be here to cover it in full. If you want to be there when that verdict comes down, make sure you're subscribed to the Homicide Room.